In the cold twilight of northern Iraq, the wind howled down from the Zagros Mountains, carrying with it the scent of snow, smoke, and something older, something primal. It was war. Not the kind shown on cable news, with tanks storming deserts and cities falling beneath televised air raids. No, this was a different kind of war. Quieter, slower, unforgiving. It moved through shadows, stalked along frozen ridge lines, and struck with the precision of a blade rather than the thunder of a hammer. It was spring 2003, and while the world's cameras tracked the advance of the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division smashing its way through southern Iraq toward Baghdad, a second front had quietly ignited far to the north, one that would shape the future of the region just as profoundly. There were no front lines here, no trenches, no endless columns of armored vehicles. The battle lines shifted daily, sometimes hourly. The terrain itself was the first enemy. Jagged mountains capped with snow, narrow valleys crisscrossed with goat paths, and winding switchbacks carved into stone by centuries of wind and footsteps. The roads were few. The infrastructure was primitive, and the politics, especially among the Kurds, were as treacherous as the terrain. But through this unforgiving land moved a small group of men whose job was to bring the hammer of American military power to bear where satellites couldn't see and conventional troops couldn't reach. These men were Green Berets, members of the U.S. Army Special Forces, trained in unconventional warfare, fluent in foreign tongues, and just as comfortable negotiating with tribal warlords as they were calling in airstrikes. Their mission was simple in its wording, complex in execution: destabilize Saddam's northern defenses, support Kurdish fighters, and deny the Iraqi army any safe haven in the north. The units deployed were part of the 10th Special Forces Group, men drawn from snowy Colorado training grounds, mountain-bred and mission-hardened. Many of them had already served in Afghanistan and the Balkans. Iraq would be their next crucible. They operated in teams, ODAs, Operational Detachment Alphas, of a dozen or fewer. In the north, 2 such teams had already begun carving out a front from the Kurdish strongholds, ODA 391 and ODA 392. Each team was a blend of combat specialties: communications sergeants, weapons experts, medics, engineers, and commanders, each member capable of taking command if the others fell. They moved with minimal support, relying on skill, stealth, and the goodwill of their Kurdish allies, the Peshmerga. The Peshmerga were not professional soldiers in the Western sense. They were veterans of decades of guerrilla struggle, hardened by generations of betrayal and oppression under Saddam's rule. Clad in mismatched uniforms and often armed with Soviet-era Kalashnikovs and RPGs, they carried with them the fierce pride of a people who had never surrendered, even when the world had looked away. The Kurds trusted few outsiders, but the Americans, by fighting alongside them, began to earn their respect, not with promises, but with action. The first days of the operation were marked by tension and reconnaissance. The ODAs moved cautiously into Kurdish territory, establishing field bases in abandoned schoolhouses, rock outcroppings, and hilltop villages forgotten by time. Each position had to be secured, scouted, defended. Supplies were limited. Resupply often came via long-range Chinooks, flying low beneath radar coverage, their black silhouettes disappearing into mountain fog before touching down for a brief, frantic offload. There was no margin for error. The Iraqi forces north of Kirkuk and Mosul weren't the shattered remnants seen in the south. Here, Republican Guard units still held key highways. Fedayeen loyalists operated in the dark, and sleeper cells existed even in Kurdish areas. Intel was never perfect. Sometimes it was a rumor traded in a market for batteries or medicine. Sometimes it was a whisper from a tribal elder in exchange for a favor owed. The enemy was elusive, but never absent. The first firefights were brief and brutal. A nighttime probe near Halabja turned into a running gun battle through a mountain pass. An IED disguised beneath loose rock nearly killed a Green Beret and 2 Peshmerga fighters as they scouted a route toward Altan-Kupri. In the hills outside Chamchamal, an ambush was narrowly avoided when a young Kurdish shepherd warned of Iraqi movement behind the ridgeline. The Americans learned quickly to trust local knowledge and to read the terrain like scripture. At night, the mountains turned bone white under starlight. The temperature plunged, and silence stretched across the valleys like a blanket. But it was never truly quiet. Radios crackled, eyes scanned the darkness. In those hours, the Green Berets would gather around digital maps, marking enemy positions, planning strikes, and coordinating with Kurdish leaders. They would drink bitter tea from battered tin cups and discuss politics, tactics, and the odds of surviving another week. Then came the build-up to something larger. Intel indicated a key crossroads west of Kirkuk, Debeka Pass, was the choke point for reinforcements moving into the region from Mosul. Satellite images showed increased Iraqi armor movements, tanks, APCs, technicals converging on the high ground. It was a strategic junction, and if the Americans could take it, they could effectively isolate Kirkuk and cripple the northern Iraqi command structure. The mission would be high risk, no armor support, no artillery, just Green Berets, Peshmerga fighters, and a limited number of Javelin anti-tank missiles. In the final hours before the operation, the Green Berets prepared their equipment with ritual-like precision. Every magazine checked, every comms unit tested, batteries charged. They moved their GMVs, ground mobility vehicles, into position beneath camouflage nets. The Peshmerga dug into the rocky slopes, laying belts of ammo beside sandbagged positions. Word spread quietly through the Kurdish villages. Tomorrow, there would be fighting. Some fled, others stayed, determined to witness history, or perhaps vengeance. The night before the engagement, one American operator sat on the edge of a bluff overlooking the valley, the dark outline of Debeka barely visible in the starlight. He lit a cigarette, the ember briefly illuminating his face. Behind him, the camp was quiet, save for whispered conversations and the low murmur of a radio. He took a drag and exhaled slowly. "It's going to be a hell of a fight," he muttered. He was right. What would follow at Debeka Pass would become one of the most legendary small unit actions of the war. A clash where American Special Forces and Kurdish guerrillas would hold off a mechanized assault against all odds, with nothing but grit, training, and a few dozen Javelin missiles. But in that cold twilight, on the eve of battle, it was just men and mountains, and the long, slow breath before the storm. Operation Iraqi Freedom had begun with a shockwave. Tomahawk cruise missiles roared through the Baghdad skyline. Bunker-busting bombs fell like thunder from invisible aircraft, and armored divisions rolled through the desert in columns stretching to the horizon. It was the kind of war America had trained for, swift, high-tech, overwhelming. But in the north, the war began differently. It began with silence, with wind moving through mountain passes, with blacked-out helicopters threading the valleys beneath Turkish radar, and with quiet men, operators, spies, and warriors, moving like ghosts through snow and rock. It hadn't been the plan. The original strategy called for a two-pronged invasion. The South would be hit by U.S. and British forces pushing north from Kuwait. Meanwhile, the North would erupt with a simultaneous offensive. The 4th Infantry Division, one of the most heavily equipped and modernized units in the American arsenal, would land in Turkey and spearhead an armored drive into Iraq's northern flank. But in March 2003, after weeks of strained negotiations and political backlash, the Turkish parliament refused to authorize the U.S. operation. Ports were closed, airspace denied. The 4th ID was left stranded offshore. Suddenly, the Northern Front vanished, at least on paper. But war doesn't stop for politics. At the Pentagon and CIA headquarters in Langley, planners scrambled to salvage the mission. The solution would not involve brigades of tanks or waves of air-mobile infantry. It would rely instead on quiet professionals, those trained to do more with less. It would rest on the shoulders of U.S. Army Special Forces and CIA paramilitary officers, and they would not be alone. For decades, the Kurdish people of northern Iraq had fought against Saddam Hussein's brutal regime. They had endured scorched earth campaigns, aerial bombardments, and chemical attacks. Entire villages had been erased. Thousands had perished in the infamous Anfal campaign. Halabja had become synonymous with horror. Yet through it all, the Peshmerga, those who face death, had endured. Now, with American support, they saw an opportunity, not just for revenge, but for liberation. The first Americans to enter northern Iraq in Operation Iraqi Freedom were not uniformed soldiers in formation, they were shadows. CIA paramilitary officers from the Special Activities Division inserted quietly, using old tribal contacts, foreign passports, and mountain routes threading the Iran-Iraq border. Their job was to establish footholds, build relationships, and lay the groundwork for what was to come. Not far behind them came teams from the 10th Special Forces Group, Green Berets trained specifically for this kind of war. ODAs, Operational Detachment Alphas, small, highly mobile teams of 12 operators, each man a specialist in weapons, engineering, medicine, intelligence, or communication, each man capable of independent command. They carried only what they could haul: sat phones and secure radios for long-distance comms, laser target designators for guiding airstrikes, encrypted GPS devices, M4A1 carbines, some customized with suppressors, optics, and infrared aiming devices. Some had Javelin anti-tank systems slung to their backs. Others carried lightweight mortars or demolition kits. Their real weapons, however, were less visible. Deep cultural training, years of operational experience, and the ability to adapt to chaos on the fly. The insertions were dangerous, weather was unpredictable, terrain was unforgiving. Many flew into the Kurdish regions aboard aging Mi-17 helicopters operated by CIA-affiliated contractors, flying nap of the earth through valleys and passes. Some crossed on foot, aided by Iranian Kurdish guides who had themselves survived decades of repression. There were no front lines here. There was no safe zone. The enemy was everywhere, or nowhere. It was impossible to tell which until the first shots rang out. Within days, the ODAs had linked up with leaders of the Kurdistan Democratic Party, KDP, and the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, PUK, two rival factions that had long vied for power in the region, but had united, uneasily, against the common enemy. The Americans knew they would have to navigate more than just terrain and enemy fire. They would have to balance tribal politics, regional rivalries, and the long memory of broken promises. But despite these tensions, a coalition began to form. Old grievances were set aside. Kurdish commanders welcomed the Green Berets with a mixture of hope and skepticism. Hope that this time the Americans would stay, skepticism born from generations of betrayal. But when the ODAs began training Kurdish fighters, coordinating airstrikes, and helping plan operations against Iraqi positions, that skepticism began to shift. In one village, a group of American operators used satellite imagery and ground reports to help Peshmerga leaders identify key Iraqi artillery positions threatening nearby. Towns within hours, they called in a precision strike by an F-15E Strike Eagle. The result was decisive. The Iraqi position obliterated, the threat neutralized. The message was clear. The Americans had come to fight, not just advise. As the days turned into weeks, the tempo increased. Kurdish fighters, under American guidance, began probing Iraqi defenses. They captured road junctions, cleared mountain passes, liberated villages long held under Saddam's iron grip. The Green Berets operated at the tip of the spear, often sleeping in abandoned buildings or on frozen ridgelines. They coordinated air support from bombers flying hours away, bringing the full weight of American firepower to bear on unsuspecting Iraqi formations. There were no supply lines, no forward operating bases, just radio codes, GPS coordinates, and trust. Trust that the Americans would keep their word, that their air cover would arrive on time, and that this time, the liberation was real. In those early days, there were setbacks, too. A misidentified vehicle convoy turned out to be friendly Peshmerga. A planned assault was delayed due to weather grounding close air support. One ODA nearly found itself overrun after a miscalculation of Iraqi reinforcements. But the teams adapted. They shifted positions, changed tactics, and kept pressure on the enemy, and the Kurds watched and followed. By early April, with the main American invasion force approaching Baghdad from the south, the north was no longer a quiet flank. The combined force of American special forces and Kurdish fighters had begun to collapse Iraqi defenses around Mosul and Kirkuk. Iraqi battalions, expecting to face armor and infantry divisions, found instead precision strikes from the sky and ambushes from the hills. Their morale eroded. Some units deserted. Others died in place. The 4th Infantry Division, once denied entry through Turkey, would eventually arrive, but by then the groundwork had been laid. It was the Green Berets and their Kurdish allies who had opened the door. The story of the Northern Front was never told with the same fanfare as the battles for Basra or the thunder run into Baghdad. But it was no less critical, and it was no less heroic. It was a campaign waged by handfuls of Americans deep in enemy territory, living out of rucksacks, trusting their lives to local fighters, and changing the course of a war. One village, one strike, one mountain at a time. They were greeted not by salutes and formation, but by handshakes rough with calluses and eyes hard with experience. The Kurdish Peshmerga emerged from the hills and villages like ghosts of a forgotten war, weathered men in mismatched fatigues, old Soviet AK-47s slung across their backs with worn canvas straps, their boots caked in decades of mud and blood. Some wore bandanas, others turbans. Their uniforms didn't match, but their cause did. Every man carried the weight of history, the memory of genocide, the sting of betrayal, and the fierce determination of a people who had never stopped fighting. For the Americans, this wasn't a traditional deployment. There were no forward operating bases, no secure perimeters, no dining facilities or air-conditioned tents. Just rough terrain, uncertain allies, and the smell of wood smoke and dust. But trust came fast, not through grand speeches or formal agreements, but through sweat and shared hardship. The Green Berets slept in dirt huts, curled into sleeping bags on cold floors, their rifles never out of reach. They shared meals of goat meat, rice, and bitter tea poured from soot-blackened kettles. Conversations were halting, conducted in broken Arabic, snippets of Kurdish, and the universal language of hand gestures, smiles, and war. The bond between American operators and their Kurdish counterparts wasn't built in conference rooms. It was forged under fire. In makeshift camps high in the hills, with tarps for roofs and crates for tables, maps were spread out and pored over with grease pencils and calloused fingers. Kurdish commanders pointed to ridgelines and trails only they knew. American team leaders showed them how to use satellite imagery, how to call for air support, how to operate secure radios and laser guidance systems. It was a mutual exchange, technology for terrain, tactics for tribal wisdom. Both sides knew the cost of failure, and there was no margin for error. The early days of the Northern Campaign were a deadly chess match played across unforgiving ground. Iraqi positions dotted the region like a cancer. Watchtowers that loomed over roads, machine gun nests dug into ridgelines, bunkers hidden in olive groves and wadis. Saddam's Republican Guard, the elite defenders of the regime, had dug in around Mosul and Kirkuk. They had tanks, artillery, and chemical munitions. They had decades of experience suppressing Kurdish uprisings, and they had no intention of giving up ground. Villages throughout the region were seeded with spies and informants. Mukhabarat, the feared Iraqi intelligence service, had long since infiltrated every community. Anyone could be a threat. A boy tending goats could be signaling artillery positions. A shopkeeper could be reporting American movements by radio. The Peshmerga knew this. So did the special forces. Caution became second nature. Patrols moved at night. Camps shifted every few days. Perimeters were set. Claymores hidden beneath rocks. Trip flares rigged with fishing line. But the Americans brought more than just caution. They brought reach. From their rough hilltop outposts, they coordinated with orbiting UAVs, Predator drones circling high and silent, scanning heat signatures and enemy movement. When an Iraqi battery fired on a Peshmerga column, the drone would catch the muzzle flash. Coordinates would be relayed in minutes. American operators would mark the target with laser designators or GPS grids, then call in the storm. And the storm came. F-15. Strike Eagles roared in low, dropping precision-guided munitions that turned bunkers into craters. F-16s sliced the sky, delivering J-dams with pinpoint accuracy. B-52 stratofortresses loomed overhead, dropping payloads that shook the ground for miles. Sometimes the thunder came from the unseen. B-2 stealth bombers, invisible to radar, flying in from Diego Garcia to deliver death from the edge of the world. Every strike was calculated. Every bomb had a purpose. The Kurds watched in awe. For decades, they had fought Saddam with little more than Kalashnikovs, homemade explosives, and grit. Now they had the wrath of the world's most advanced military behind them. But awe soon turned to resolve. They weren't spectators. They were partners. Every American-guided airstrike was followed by a Kurdish ground assault. Villages were liberated. Roads were seized. Iraqi positions that had stood for years fell in hours. Still, it was never easy. Some days brought heavy losses. A Peshmerga squad would walk into a minefield left over from the Iran-Iraq War. A sniper hidden in a mosque would pin down a joint patrol for hours. An Iraqi artillery strike would land too close to an American forward team. But they kept moving, kept fighting, kept learning. One night, under a sliver of moonlight, a Kurdish guide led an ODA through a ravine flanking an Iraqi-held village. The path was narrow, the rocks slick with moss. They moved in silence, the Americans with NVGs scanning every shadow, the Kurds relying on instinct. At dawn, they reached the overwatch point. From there, they spotted an artillery battery hidden behind a school. Children were still being used as human shields. Saddam's tactics were as ruthless as ever. The Americans held fire. They waited. Hours passed. Eventually, the children were moved. The artillery was prepped for another salvo. That's when the team struck. A single laser designation painted the target. Moments later, a pair of F-15s descended like avenging spirits, their bombs cracking the sky open. The battery disappeared in a plume of flame and smoke. The Kurds surged forward, seizing the village. They wept as they raised their flag. This was how the war in the north was won. Not in sweeping battles with massed armor, but in dozens of smaller victories, each one a mix of modern firepower and ancient resolve. American technology gave the Kurds the edge. Kurdish courage gave the Americans the heart. Together, they unraveled Saddam's grip on the mountains, town by town, pass by pass. And though the world watched the push to Baghdad with rapt attention, in the shadowed hills of the north, another liberation was unfolding, one that would echo through Kurdish memory for generations. Because here, amid stone huts, mountain passes, and the rising smoke of precision fire, a promise was kept. A people long betrayed found allies who stayed, and warriors found a brotherhood that neither war nor time could break. In the dry hills near Sham-Shamal, the war was fought in whispers and shadows. One early mission would become the template for how America's most elite soldiers and Kurdish fighters would change the tide in northern Iraq, not with tanks or overwhelming numbers, but with precision, stealth, and trust earned in blood. The target was a mosque, But this was no ordinary place of worship. Intelligence, first from aerial surveillance, then confirmed by a trembling Kurdish informant, revealed it to be an Iraqi command post, cloaked behind minarets and prayer calls. Trucks had been seen coming and going at night. Antennas bristled from the roof. Satellite images showed armed guards, sandbagged firing positions. The mosque was being used to coordinate Republican Guard movements, and everyone knew it. But hitting a mosque came with risk. Not just the tactical risk of retaliation, but the moral weight of striking a religious site. The Americans deliberated. They cross-checked intelligence. They sent a local informant inside, an old man whose son had been taken by the regime years ago. He returned pale, but resolute. It was true. The courtyard was filled with military gear. Radios buzzed in Arabic. Officers barked orders. It was a war room disguised as a house of God. That night, the Americans moved silently onto a hill overlooking Cham-Chamal. The team, a mix of Green Berets and CIA paramilitary officers, set up their laser designator, its beam invisible to the naked eye but deadly all the same. The operator whispered into his mic, giving the coordinates. High above, a B-1B Lancer flew in silent orbit, its payload ready. The JDAM released. For several long seconds, nothing moved. Then the sky split. The mosque erupted in a pillar of fire, stone and steel. The blast lit the hills like lightning. A tremor rippled through the earth. When the dust settled, the command post was gone. The minaret lay in pieces. The war had spoken with surgical precision. It was devastating. And it was a message. There would be no sanctuary for Saddam's war machine, not even in places cloaked in piety. As the northern campaign accelerated, the Americans began shifting strategy. It was no longer just about targeting enemy assets. It was about building an army from a people long denied one. The Peshmerga were fighters by nature and by necessity. For years they had battled Saddam with rusting rifles and limited hope. Now, they had something new. The backing of the most advanced military on earth. But they needed training. They needed to be more than guerrillas. They needed to become an irregular force capable of coordinated assaults. The Green Berets took to the task with quiet urgency. In mountain clearings, on old soccer fields, in abandoned villages, they set up training grounds. Wooden stakes became enemy markers. Flashlights stood in for gun barrels. Chalk lines on dirt formed squad movement patterns. They taught the Kurds how to move in fire teams, how to flank, how to conduct bounding overwatch. Radios were distributed, then explained. The Kurds learned call signs, how to request air support, how to communicate across ridgelines and valleys without giving away positions. Some lessons were technical, others were brutal. A botched live fire drill injured 2 Kurdish fighters, but they came back the next day, rifles slung, ready to learn more. And learn they did. They adapted fast, faster than many had expected. Their knowledge of the terrain was encyclopedic. They moved like ghosts through rock and scrub, vanishing into ravines, cresting ridgelines with barely a sound. They weren't just soldiers now. They were becoming a hybrid force. Part guerrilla, part conventional, all lethal. The Americans gave them confidence. The Kurds gave them fire. It was a partnership born in necessity and sealed in action. Then came the push, the target, Halabja. To the outside world, Halabja was a name etched in sorrow, a small town forever stained by Saddam's 1988 chemical massacre. Thousands had died there in one of the worst gas attacks in modern history. Men, women, children, choked, burned, erased. For the Kurds, Halabja wasn't just a battlefield. It was a wound. And now, it was also a symbol. Taking it would send a message, not just to Saddam's regime, but to history itself, that the Kurds had returned. And this time, they weren't alone. The operation began before dawn. American aircraft circled overhead, F-15s and F-16s stacked in holding patterns. their bombs armed with laser guidance, their pilots watching from thousands of feet above. On the ground, Kurdish columns moved through rocky passes and dry riverbeds, guided by U.S. Special Forces teams. They carried RPGs, PKMs, old AK-47s with duct tape on the stocks. The Americans carried satellite radios and javelins. It was a mismatch of gear, but not of resolve. As they approached Halabja, Iraqi defenders opened up. Mortars thumped from tree lines. Machine guns rattled from sandbagged rooftops. The Kurds hit the ground, returned fire, and called out positions. The Americans relayed the coordinates to orbiting jets. Minutes later, bombs dropped from the sky like thunderbolts. Enemy bunkers disintegrated. Mortar crews vanished in flashes of light. The defenders broke. Street by street, the Peshmerga advanced. Some buildings were booby-trapped, others had snipers, but the momentum never stopped. One group of fighters cleared a schoolhouse with nothing but grenades and AKs, kicking in doors and sweeping room by room. Another scaled the side of a government building under cover of smoke, tossing Molotovs through windows. The Ba'athist resistance collapsed under the weight of fury and precision. And then, just after noon, the Kurdish flag was raised in the town square. There were no grand speeches, just tears. Older men dropped to their knees, weeping. Women hugged fighters covered in soot and blood. A mother kissed the forehead of a Kurdish soldier as if he were her own. For them, this was more than liberation. It was resurrection. The ghost town of 1988 had become a symbol of something new. A place once choked by gas, now breathing freedom. The Americans stood back, letting the Kurds take it in. They didn't need recognition. This wasn't about medals. It was about doing what had long been denied, giving people their homes back, giving justice a face. And as the smoke drifted over Halabja, blending into the fading sunlight, it was clear. The tide had turned. Saddam's forces weren't just retreating, they were unraveling. And in their place, a new chapter had begun. One written not just in steel and fire, but in trust, in alliance, in the belief that no tyrant, no matter how brutal, could silence the will of a free people forever. From there, the campaign moved fast. Each town captured became a launch pad for the next. U.S. Special Forces split into multiple operational detachments, pushing toward different targets, Mosul, Kirkuk, Tikrit. Near the town of Kalak, a U.S. team led a daring raid on an Iraqi supply convoy, ambushing it in the dead of night and seizing fuel, weapons, and documents. Every move was a mix of lightning strikes and psychological warfare. Leaflets fell from the sky urging surrender. Loudspeakers blared Kurdish anthems. Villagers rose against the retreating regime. But the biggest fight came at the gates of Kirkuk, an oil-rich city and a symbol of Iraqi control. Kirkuk was heavily defended. The Iraqis had dug trenches, placed anti-aircraft guns, and fortified the outskirts with T-55 tanks and BMPs. In response, the Americans devised a bold plan: hit hard, fast, and use the terrain to their advantage. Special Forces teams flanked Iraqi armor, calling in airstrikes to destroy tanks before they could fire a shot. Kurdish fighters stormed trenches and buildings, room by room. One U.S. JTAC Joint Terminal Attack Controller spent hours directing strikes from the rooftop of a warehouse, ducking sniper fire while coordinating B-1 bombers above. By the third day, Iraqi lines broke. Regime forces either fled or surrendered. The city fell not with a whimper, but with roars of gunfire and cheers. In the town square, a Kurdish commander stood beside a U.S. Green Beret, raising both the Kurdish and American flags side by side. As Kirkuk was secured, another battle raged for Mosul. Intelligence had revealed a Republican Guard division regrouping on the outskirts, planning a last stand. The Americans moved fast. They used speed, stealth, and air power to disrupt Iraqi planning. A Special Forces sniper team infiltrated a hillside and took out an enemy officer from 1,000 meters, scattering his men. Kurdish forces advanced from 3 directions, enveloping the city. By the time the dust settled, Mosul was in their hands. Throughout the campaign, the Americans relied on more than firepower. They built alliances. They brokered truces between rival Kurdish factions. They coordinated humanitarian aid. In liberated towns, U.S. medics treated wounded civilians while engineers repaired wells and generators. Their mission was not just to destroy Saddam's regime, but to help build something in its place. By April 2003, the Northern Front was secure. Baghdad had fallen. Saddam was on the run. The Kurds had regained their homeland, at least in part, and the Americans had proven that a small number of elite troops, partnered with determined locals and backed by air power, could achieve what once required divisions. The Special Forces operators melted back into the shadows. Some returned home, others stayed behind to advise new Iraqi and Kurdish units. Their faces were rarely seen on the news. There were no parades, no speeches. But those who were there remembered everything: the echo of J-dams, the handshake of a Kurdish elder, the chill of mountain air before a mission. The Northern Front of Operation Iraqi Freedom remains one of the most effective and unconventional campaigns in modern warfare. It was a masterclass in joint operations, asymmetric tactics, and the power of human connection in war. Where others needed divisions, they used teams. Where others needed tanks, they used laser-guided precision. Where others saw obstacles, they saw opportunity. And in the silent mountains of northern Iraq, they made history. One village, one firefight, one alliance at a time.